Article 9. Accessibility. This section begins with 3 comments highlighted in panels. Digital inclusion often excludes people unable, unwilling to use digital technology, hui participant. A blind-friendly route to transport stops, that is, no huge stretches of unsafe space without footpath, no super difficult roundabout crossings or other busy roads with no lights. Survey respondent. My primary concern is about accessible information. I need alerts about changes in the neighbourhood. When the council digs up our footpaths, they put handwritten notes in our letterbox, which rarely get read. Some neighbours do alert us, but in fairness, they all lead busy lives. Survey respondent. Introduction. Government should make it possible for disabled people to live independently and participate in their communities. This means that any place open to the public, including buildings, roads, schools and hospitals, must be accessible to disabled people. General comment. The IMM recognises that some progress has been made in recent years to increase accessibility in certain areas of public life, but there is still a need for greater consistency in accessibility around the country. Importance of Article 9 to disabled people in New Zealand. Accessibility is vital to ensure that disabled people can participate in public life, work, travel, and that they can receive information on an equal basis with others. Current place of Article 9 in New Zealand law and practice. There are legislation and codes that govern accessibility in New Zealand. Building Act 2004 and Building Regulations 1992. Local Government Act 2002. Resource Management Act 1991. New Zealand Urban Design Protocol, Endnote 86. The Guidelines for Facilities for Blind and Vision-Impaired Pedestrians, Endnote 87. The Pedestrian Planning and Design Guide, Endnote 88. The Disability Strategy, the Accessibility Charter, and the related Accessibility Guide, Leading the Way in Accessible Information, Endnote 89. New Zealand Building Standard, NZS 4121:2001, Design for Access and Mobility, Buildings and Associated Facilities. The DPO Coalition worked with the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment to develop a guide for the practical application of universal design principles in the resource Buildings for Everyone, Designing for Access and Usability, Endnote 90. Committee's previous dialogue with the state on Article 9. In its list of issues, the Disability Committee asked the government to provide information on measures taken to ensure that all public buildings are made fully accessible, independently audited and verified. Progress in the implementation of the Building Act 2004 and Building Code, including premises where fewer than 10 people are employed, which are currently exempted. Measures taken for the provision of universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible, green and public spaces, having regard to particular barriers faced by women, children and older disabled people. Steps to ensure that the wide application of the concept of universal design is endorsed by authorities at all levels of public service provision, including the number of wheelchair-accessible buses and taxis. And measures taken to ensure that electronic ticketing systems for public transport and journey travel timetable information are accessible. The government's response included information about the Building Act, which requires reasonable access and progressive upgrade of buildings. The government confirmed there are no plans to amend the Building Act to remove the exemption for small factories and industrial buildings, Endnote 91. There have been no explicit measures taken to ensure universal access to public spaces, most of which are local authority controlled and regulated under the Local Government Act and the Resource Management Act. Comment on the realisation of Article 9 in New Zealand. Some measures have been taken since by the government, local government and transport operators to improve accessibility. The New Zealand Disability Strategy 2016 to 2026 promotes universal design. Kāinga Ora, formerly Housing New Zealand Corporation, new builds are required to reflect the principles of universal design, and the government is considering how to incorporate them into planning for Kiwi-build homes. Cabinet has agreed to commence the design of an approach to achieve a fully accessible New Zealand in collaboration with stakeholders, which may include accessibility legislation. Endnote 92. The increased percentage of wheelchair-accessible buses is also welcomed. However, many disabled public transport users still experience challenges accessing transport using inaccessible ticketing systems and frustrations at the regional variation in ticketing and discount systems. People in rural areas are particularly disadvantaged in their access to public transport. There were 345 taxis with wheelchair hoists in New Zealand in 2018, down from 435 in 2017. There are 2,361 wheelchair-accessible public transport buses, up from 2,210 in 2017, and making up 94.5% of the total fleet in New Zealand. Endnote 93. At present, there is regional variation in the application of accessible concessions and electronic ticketing systems. The government anticipates that, in the future, payment for public transport will be provided consistently across the country and ticketing will become more accessible. However, there are significant concerns around the introduction of inaccessible electronic ticketing and self-service kiosks, such as those used by Air New Zealand, the major air carrier in New Zealand. The government is the majority shareholder in Air New Zealand and has a duty to ensure that its responsibility as a signatory to the Disability Convention is met in relation to accessibility of transport. Private construction lags behind public buildings in recognizing the need for accessibility to be included in the design phase, and in particular to ensure new homes follow universal design principles. A common theme at consultation hui was that disabled people need accessible transport to get out and live life. Other issues raised included the need for accessible information, housing, and public buildings and spaces. The high cost of accessible technology and the lack of people to provide training on such technology was also raised. There is a growing number of micro-vehicles and devices such as e-scooters, many of which can be used on footpaths and which can cause safety issues for disabled pedestrians, including when parked. Hui and survey participants gave a plethora of examples where accessibility requirements were either not addressed or not addressed properly. One person noted, "All very well to say there is a ramp to go into a building, but if the doors are weighted too heavily, then you're stuffed." Recommendations. The IMM recommends that the government 25. Develop and agree on comprehensive definitions of universal design and accessibility and use these definitions consistently. 26. Update New Zealand Standard NZS 4121:2001 and develop a comprehensive range of compatible accessibility standards to cover all aspects of community and civic access. 27. Ensure accessibility and universal design be implemented in all A. New housing developments, B. Public spaces, C. Transportation and ticketing systems, D. Shared use spaces, and E. Technologies and communications. 28. Implement robust strategies and timelines to upgrade existing public infrastructure to meet best practice accessible design standards. 29. Implement systems to require regular monitoring and/or auditing against minimum standards of accessibility of all publicly accessible buildings, workplaces, civic or recreational areas, and public services. 30. Co-design accessible systems with disabled people, taking particular account of marginalized groups such as children.